Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today with Dr. Alastair Renfrew, a professor of English and Comparative Literature at Durham University. Alastair, welcome.
Hello, delighted to be here, Pascal.
Glad having you. You are another one of the wonderful minds that I recently met when we had this great conference in Pskov, Russia, and you have a different approach towards Russia, although you are also from coming from Russia studies and so on, but you are also a professor of literature, and you kind of said that one of the things that irks you is that you think that there's a lot of misunderstanding, not just Russophobia, but misunderstanding in the West about Russian foreign policy. And why don't we start there? Can you give us a little bit of your overview on the misunderstandings?
Yeah, I mean, Russophobia is clearly linked to this historical misunderstanding. Just a little bit of a kind of prelude on my background. I describe myself as an ex-Russianist. I was a Russianist for 20 years, and I'm someone who kind of lost interest in Russia, if I can be that frank, in the early 2000s, the kind of rise of the statist, borderline authoritarian modern Russia wasn't nearly as interesting to me as either the Soviet Union or the transitional period. But what has kind of provoked my interest, and this is fairly obvious, again, recently, is the current conflict and the circumstances that led to it. And a kind of reconfirmation to me that just as we have failed to do at various periods over the long history of relations, particularly between Britain and Russia, but I think it applies more broadly, both at the level of elites and at the level of public consciousness, we really don't understand Russia or its motivations. Now, to frame that specifically in terms of foreign policy, which was what your question was, the fundamental thing to communicate is that Western countries, Britain, in the 19th century, chief among them, have consistently interpreted a defensive strategy on Russia's part as an aggressive or expansionist policy. That to me is the heart of the matter. That explains many historical standoffs between Russia and the West, and we can perhaps talk about those in detail. But it also fundamentally explains how we got to where we've got to in the Ukraine conflict. Russia, and we can go back as far as as you wish. I mean, this really is, as well as being the kind of cornerstone of foreign policy, I think it's also deeply ingrained in the Russian psyche. This defensive mentality, this sense that Russia, the Russian state, is perpetually under threat, encircled. And that produces a kind of entrenched attitude of mind, which is then interpreted outside Russia as a manifestation of aggression or territorial ambition.
I mean, this is I think very, very important, because the view also of Stalin and of other leaders of the Soviet Union was that they're trying to expand, right? But what we see actually, also when we go to the archives and others like Jeff Roberts and so on, did that, right? Is this inherent kind of the defensive thinking of Stalin of how to make sure that he would not be attacked from either side. Actually, if you go further into the 1930s, he was very worried about the Japanese, very, very worried, because it split his forces so much. And also later on, that with the occupation of Eastern Europe, basically, is nothing that he was content with as a status quo, right? So because it drains the Red Army, the forces, it spreads them so much. Today's Russia is portrayed again as being neo-Soviet and also a neo-Russian empire that just wants to expand its territory. But I think if you actually look at everything that the Russian foreign policy elite tells us, that's nothing could be further from their thinking. What they want is to secure the Russian borders. Can you maybe give us your interpretation?
I mean, absolutely. The period that you referenced there, the 1930s and the Stalinist period, that of course is prepared by the moment of 1917.
Mm.
And what most people outside Russia, even educated people, don't choose to recall, if they ever knew, is that the Russian revolutions of 1917 were followed by an extended conflict, sometimes referred to as a civil war, sometimes referred to as a revolutionary war. And during that conflict, Russia was invaded by expeditionary forces from Britain, Germany, France, Austria, the United States, Canada, and Japan. There was a significant Japanese force on Russian territory in the years between 1918 and 1922. And this prepares, if we think in terms of kind of Marxist symbology, the revolution is made nominally in the name of a world revolution, and that policy quickly transforms into socialism in one country, which in itself is a manifestation of a defensive stance. And that defensive stance is a product of the sense of being encircled and embattled. And since the Civil War of 1918 to roughly 1921, 1922, Soviet foreign policy, we can talk about Soviet foreign policy as distinct from contemporary Russian foreign policy, was basically conditioned by a very realistic fear that the Western powers would continue to seek to undermine the stability, security, and unity of the Soviet Union. So that prepares almost everything that happened between 21-22 and the outbreak of the Second World War. Everything during that period has to be interpreted fundamentally in the context of a defensive strategy rather than the rather kind of the rather cinematic sense that we're sometimes given of Russia or the Soviet Union as an expansionist power, hell-bent on exporting socialist revolution. It made certain movements in that direction through the Comintern largely, and we know that there was support for trade union movements, socialist movements outside of Russia, but that's secondary to the defensive stance. The defensive stance is where we have to begin to think about how we understand the motivations and the strategic priorities of Russia. During the Soviet period, before the Soviet period, I think that also held sway, and we can talk about that if you wish, but certainly since the Soviet period, certainly since the moment in 1998 when post-Soviet Russia realized once again that the Western powers, the NATO powers, were not necessarily its friend and ally in this process of transition from socialism to a market economy.
Hey, just a very quick note. The best way to support this channel is by signing up for my free Substack. You can also help with a paid subscription there, or you can get some of our new merch on neutralitystudies.com. Links below. See you there. I mean, this is one of the fascinating things, right? In one of his final speeches, Gorbachev actually alluded, he took over all of the jargon. He also said, we haven't learned how to use freedom yet. Russia started using the Soviet Union first, and then Russia started using the language and the jargon of the West, but somehow then at some point had to understand that they would never be let into NATO, and NATO would not dissolve, and that this, of course, then creates the security problem all over again. And Gorbachev's great thing was the common European home, right?
Yeah.
As in, everybody secured together, and he had reasonable ground to believe that this could work, because he just saw how over a period of 50, 60 years, these arch enemies, France and Germany, made up with each other and managed to become, an economic unit basically. So it's not unfounded. Maybe you can speak to that, but before that, can you because I belong to the people who were utterly unaware that between 1918 and 1922 there were expeditionary forces. Can you talk a little bit about that? And and it goes hand in hand, of course, with the first Napoleon, then the Crimean War, and then the First World War. All of these waves where Russia was one of the targets of destruction. But I wasn't aware of the 18 to 22 one. Can you just explain that history a little bit?
Well, again, the kind of popular understanding of the Russian revolutions, and this is understandable to a large extent, but the popular understanding focuses on immediate events on one night in October to go to the absolute heart of the matter. The reality of the Russian Revolution is that it was effectively fought until 1922. And the expeditionary forces that I referred to from United States, Canada, Britain, France, Japan, and I think the Czechoslovak Legion played a minor role in the Siberian theater of conflict. This is how unlikely it seems to us. But the point is, one of the reasons to call that war a revolutionary war as opposed to a civil war is that a civil war implies that it's an internal conflict. Right. And actually, the conflict wasn't an entirely internal conflict. The conflict is better characterized as a conflict in which foreign powers attempted to undo the success of the Bolsheviks, the political success of the Bolsheviks. I should say that I'm not a historian, but I'm someone who has relied on the historical sources in my own work. But if you look at historical maps of Russia between the moment of empire and the establishment of the Soviet Union, there are some quite dramatic maps which demonstrate how little territory the Bolsheviks controlled. It's almost a tiny kind of, the part of the European heartland was controlled by the Bolsheviks in 1920. And it's actually a miracle in my estimation that the Bolsheviks, the Reds, were ultimately successful in the Civil War. If you look at the dynamics of that conflict, a more likely outcome was victory for the white forces, including the expeditionary forces. So this, people sometimes talk about the Russian psyche as being prepared by a long historical experience of invasion and encirclement. But here, deep into the 20th century, we have an example where Russia, in whatever form we conceive it, this kind of hybrid form between the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, came very close to being conquered effectively by foreign forces.
Was it, in your estimation, was that actually just as dangerous at the moment, or even more dangerous than how far the Nazis came in 45? In 41, 42? When they almost reached Moscow. That was a huge land invasion, right? But the one around the 1920s then was also pretty dramatic in that case, huh?
It was extremely dramatic. The difference between these two examples, of course, is that the latter example, 1942, that's an example that still lives in the memory of a vanishingly small number of people who remain alive and experience that. And you visited Russia recently, and anybody who visited Russia, anybody who has visited Russia at any point since the end of what they call the Great Patriotic War will be conscious of that as the definitive moment at which this defensive imperative was confirmed. And again, we don't need to rehearse the scale of the sacrifice that Russia made in order to defeat fascism. It's again, outside the American history classroom, I think most people understand that without Soviet activity on the Eastern Front, the outcome of the Second World War would have been completely different. I mean, that's the most obvious historical fact I think that we can point to. So again, the need for a defensive strategy has been confirmed again and again and again. And it doesn't, the key point that I would emphasize for your listeners is it doesn't really matter what the politics of the particular government we're talking about are. And this is a game we sometimes play with Russia. We adjudicate between more liberal or more authoritarian governments. We set Alexander the First off against Nikolai the First, or we set Gorbachev off against Brezhnev, or we set Putin off against Yeltsin. But it doesn't. The key point is not the content of the political program. The key point is the extent to which different governments have successfully prosecuted this defensive foreign policy. I mean, Putin, to come to the present moment, Putin is a product, as we know, of the Cold War. His entire psyche is immersed in this experience of a kind of geopolitical standoff, a sense of being encircled and embattled. Putin's politics, I want to suggest, are almost irrelevant. They seem irrelevant to me. I mean, Putin's politics are not my politics. But to adjudicate a figure like Putin on the basis of the content of his political program is absurd.
Right.
Putin is fundamentally a Russian statist, and he occupies a role that many Russian leaders at different points in the historical past have played, regardless of their political orientation. It's almost irrelevant. The key point that I keep coming back to is to understand Russian foreign policy through the lens of what we might call forward defense.
There are very good papers and studies about this, but it's still the general image in Europe is of Russia as an inherently offensive state that tries to maximize its territory for whatever reason. And it doesn't matter how many times our Russian colleagues keep saying, I mean, just look at the landmass we have. I mean, it's difficult enough to manage this one. Why do you think we want more? And the many times actually that the Russians have just signaled that what they want is a security order, right? Because this would then bring stability. If you had a neutrality agreement for Ukraine and you had a order, even if it's Minsk and so on, that stabilizes the borders and secures the borders, then the Russian problem goes away. But what we also see is the constant working against that kind of securing the border and securitizing on the other side the border by making Russia vulnerable, by threatening Russia with a lot of missiles right at its border. And Russia then says, like, we cannot accept that. Look, this is not our idea of security, of being 8 minutes away from obliteration, right? So why? Of course, we have the neocons and so on, who duplicitous game and so on. But why is it that the Russians are so bad at selling their defensive narrative?
Well, I don't think they're bad at selling it. I think they're simply not listened to. I mean, if we go back to Putin, this really is an example worth, I think, dwelling on. Putin spent the first 8 years of his leadership absolutely convinced that Russia should and could become part of a broader European and global security order.
Right.
That was his clear conviction. And he made statements which I can recall, causing my jaw to drop. Putin in 2002, in an early internet broadcast that's been memory hold, I believe is the expression. No one refers to it anymore. He uttered the words that he could envisage a European Union of which Russia could be a part.
He said that.
He said that in 2002, in March 2002. When I watched the evening news that night to see how it was reported, we were informed that Putin's wife was very interested in French cinema. The political dimension was just completely ignored. And that defines this first phase of Putin's experience as leader of post-Soviet Russia. He constantly reiterates this message. I think much to the annoyance of some of his political opponents at home. It might come as a shock to some of your listeners to characterize Vladimir Putin as in any way naive. But there is a naivety to this early phase of Putin's leadership. And in my estimation, there is a naivety in a general sense about Russia and the Russians. And that comes back to your question about selling the narrative. I think Russians generally believe if we tell the West the truth about ourselves, eventually they'll believe us.
They will understand us, and they will. We just need to clear up the misunderstanding. There's a misunderstanding. So what you need is the bridges, Dmitry Trenin in New York, and everybody, and cooperation, and so on. And it's not just it wasn't just Vladimir Putin. I mean, we probably need to reframe it as a naive moment. It includes people like Jeffrey Sachs, who couldn't believe that his country would help Poland getting out of a currency crisis, but wouldn't do the same thing for Russia. And he couldn't believe it until they laughed him out of the office. And still, even after that, he thought these is, again, misunderstandings. And only in 30 years retrospective, we start to understand that there is a systematic behind that at the point was just not clear. It wasn't even clear to the president of Russia. That's how unclear this was. Can you expand on that?
Well, the only international politics is a realist international politics, and belief and hope. The historical record tells us that they're just cast to the side of the road. Serially, it happens again and again. Still in 2007, famously in his Munich address, Putin is attempting to communicate this message of integration. By 2008, and again, this has been rehearsed many, many times, Putin attended the Bucharest summit of NATO as a guest. He was physically present.
Was he? I didn't know.
He attended the Bucharest summit as a guest. And at that very same summit, the NATO countries confirmed their policy in relation to the accession of Georgia and Ukraine. And here we are. Now, in retrospect, that looks very deliberate. And in retrospect, it's also the end of a phase. It's the end of one phase and the beginning of another phase. Again, in many discussions of the current conflict in Ukraine, commentators remind us that this didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014. It effectively started in 2008. The preparation for the conflict began in 2008. And from 2008, we see a pivot in Russian foreign policy back towards this more realistic defense imperative. In the years preceding the Ukraine conflict, the invasion in 2022, and the 4.5 years since, once again, the Russian foreign minister has told his Western counterparts, he's told the global media over and over again what Russia's policy is in relation to Ukraine, how that policy came into being, and what the logical underpinnings of that policy are. To anybody who listens, it's quite clear. So we're left to speculate on why. Either political elites in the West or the broader mass of the public in the West don't appear willing or able to listen to this very clear message. And that brings us back to this prevalent topic of Russophobia. Some kind of blockage intervenes, some kind of programmed historical fear intervenes, and that historical fear, in some respects, is real, and in other respects, it's manufactured. It's manufactured by the same political elites who are, according to their own kind of policy priorities, simply not willing to acknowledge the defensive nature of Russian foreign policy.
I think we will still discuss this for a long time, but what it is that makes it so impossible for the Europeans to actually accept that Russia has legitimate security concerns, just like the Georgians have legitimate security concerns, just like the Ukrainians have legitimate security concerns. What it is that seems to that then turns around, the warning that Vladimir Putin gave in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. He will warn, like, look, this is the path to ruin and rupture. We must correct this. Again, this misunderstanding. And his words, today, everybody in the West points their finger at that speech and says, this is when they became belligerent. This is when they became aggressive. We're like, no, it's a prediction. It's a warning that everything is going the wrong way. 2008, Bucharest comes along, and who tests the promise of 2008? Who tests it? Mr. Saakashvili tests it.
Yeah.
Of course, the Russians do what you do when you get this attack and you have the war rolling on, and then the West immediately says, like, look, we told you this is exactly why we promised Georgia accession, right? Because the Russians are so dangerous. I mean, like, well, you're creating these self-fulfilling prophecies that the Russians actually warn about. Say, like, look, this is very bad, and then it happens, and they say, like, look, we told you. So it seems, is it a form of confirmation bias that the Europeans are running, like, on an industrial scale?
Well, again, we might speculate on the psychological dimension of this, and that might be a conversation for another day. But as I say, something intervenes. There's a blockage. Whether we can characterize it as straightforward misunderstanding, or whether there is something more profound occurring in the deep psyche of the Western powers. But you're absolutely right. 2008, with the so-called Russo-Georgian War in the autumn, is really the beginning of a new Cold War. It's the first provocation. It's the first indication that the Russians have realized that they're not being listened to. And as I say, they're going to have to revert to what I've characterized as a forward defensive policy. If we're provoked, we're going to respond to the provocation. Now, again, there's a parallel here with the preparation for the Ukraine conflict, I think, because from the Western strategic point of view, or from a certain cynical Western strategic point of view, this might look like a win-win situation. To wit, we'll provoke you, and if you accept our provocation, we've taken another step forward. If you respond aggressively to our provocation, we'll cast you as the aggressor.
Right.
But what happened in Georgia in 2008, in a very limited scale, I mean, it's a kind of minor tragedy, what happened in Georgia. And those temporary partitions in Ossetia and Abkhazia are still in place.
Yeah.
If you drive from Tbilisi to the border, the agency from which you hire a car will give you a map and say, look, you mustn't take your car into this area, and this area. And there's a transponder in the car, and we'll know. And this is absurd. You drive even from west to east in Georgia, in the low-lying countries, hundreds of miles from Ossetia, and you become conscious at a certain point that you are close to one of the partition zones, and that's been the case since 2008. Now, thankfully, in Georgia, the extent of the casualties in that so-called war was limited.
Yeah.
And the conflict, for better or for worse, stabilized around these partitioned zones. when we come to the period between 2014 and 2022 in Ukraine, we have the same tactic on a much larger and more belligerent scale. And one of the questions that is discussed retrospectively within Russia in terms of political strategy is, could and should Russia have responded sooner to the provocation of 2014? Now, one answer to that is, well, it did respond with the annexation of Crimea.
Right.
But it didn't respond to the ongoing destruction of ethnic Russians who happen to be citizens of Ukraine living in Donbas. Russia exercised restraint for 8 years while ethnic Russians were being killed in Donbas by their own government. So the provocation was much more extreme than Mr. Saakashvili's little adventure towards the Ossetian border. Now, I think, again, the point for the present conversation that we're having is most objective observers would characterize Russian policy in that 8-year period between 2014 and 2022 as one of restraint.
Yeah, but it's like this is exactly what frustrates me so much with the narrative in the West, right? They at this point just completely again memory hole that entire experience, and if they mention anything at all, they mention the Russian supported separatists in the East, right? As if though this was a deliberate attempt at already fighting a war in all but name against Ukraine, when in fact, if you look at the Minsk agreements, there were 2 of them. If you look at the development of the entire strategy of Russia, it was to keep the Donbas inside Ukraine, those territories autonomous with a veto over foreign policy, which de facto creates a neutral Ukraine, which de facto solves the problem. That was a very clear strategy, and not in 8 years did Russia recognize these two self-declared republics, right? For very good reasons, because you don't want to sabotage your own defensive approach, and all of that is utterly completely misconstrued.
Well, as late as April 2022, after the invasion, what you've just described was still more or less the Russian policy.
That's what they were willing to go back to in Istanbul.
Yes. So even after the conflict had broken out, Russia was still willing to sue for peace on the basis that Donetsk and Lugansk would remain part of the Ukrainian state, but with autonomous status. They were so again, there's a consistency to this, if essentially defensive foreign policy. But as I said, it seemed more to more in line with the so-called strategy of the Western powers, simply to ignore the underpinnings of that. And again, without rehearsing what happened in April 2022, I suppose we won't know exactly what happened in April 2022 until a few years after the conflict is. But again, an objective observer might draw the conclusion that even the Ukrainian government at that point were willing to accept that as a price for a cessation of the conflict. Now, again, we won't know until a number of years after the conflict has resolved. Goodness knows when that'll be. How many lives have been lost between now and April 2022? A conservative estimate, it runs into the hundreds of thousands. It may be more than that. And the question what we've characterized as the strategists of the Western countries, the NATO countries, the question they have to answer, I think, is what has been gained in exchange for casualties on that scale on both sides. The answer to me is, again, someone who's not a historian, who's not a political theorist, I'm a literary scholar, but the answer from my perspective to that question appears to be nothing. Nothing has been gained. we're no further forward in terms of a global resolution of this conflict between the legitimate security interests of Russia and whatever the strategic priorities of NATO happen to be. We're no closer to a political solution. And in my estimation, we remain some way away from a resolution to the conflict itself.
No, that is absolutely right. Although it presupposes that gaining would mean something beneficial, right, to all parties. And we know that there is enough people in the transatlantic alliance, especially the neocon circles, who don't think in those terms, right? They think in terms of how to maximize benefit on their side to the detriment of everybody else. And if you look at it from that perspective, what they gained is the permanent severance of European-Russian ties, right? No more Nord Stream, no more cooperation for the next 20 to 30 years at least, right? So permanent severance of Russia from the Europeans,
Yeah.
dependence of the Europeans on on the US, the strengthening of the military-industrial complex for the US, and let's not forget, these sick people, they think of sacrificing Ukrainians in order to bleed dry the Russians as a good thing. These sick people who stand in Congress and say, like, look, best investment ever, like the Russians are bleeding, the Ukrainians are doing the dirty work for us, and we have a booming war economy over here with all the weapon sales we do. Look, ka-ching, ka-ching. I mean, from that perspective, there is large gain actually on that side. But this is, of course, one of the cynic interpretations that especially I would argue um, um, people like Vladimir Putin, who actually believe that, you know, at the end you need some sort of resolution, right? You're looking for some status quo that works. That wouldn't really ring very strong with them. Although it's weird to me because he himself said he knows these people and he has seen a lot of presidents come and go and talk one way before they get elected and another way after they get elected. He himself says so. So it's not clear to me why it seems that he attached so much value, so much faith into the possibility to construct this kind of cooperative frameworks when it is the other side that obviously says we don't want it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great mysteries of the conflict and the geopolitical circumstances that surround it. Why Putin appears still to believe in a resolution of some kind in those terms. And there are many political voices in Russia who categorically just don't believe that anymore. And as the conflict progresses, one of the fears is that those voices become louder and more influential. But to return to your point of, you know, what is gained, and again, this might broaden our conversation out too much, but you know, for what it's worth, it's clear that NATO and even the Trump administration, if we can, you know, be that specific, clearly there are differences in the approach of the Trump administration compared to the Biden administration. You know, many people have drawn the conclusion that Trump is kind of not interested in Ukraine. That may be true, but the Trump administration remains interested in Russia being tied down. And there have been many other events that have taken place since 2022 that might not have taken place quite so easily were Russia not tied down. And the second point is that, you know, Trump may not care too much about a resolution to the Ukrainian conflict, but it's not contrary to his broad interests to have Russian energy infrastructure destabilized by the Ukrainian proxy. If there's one binding thread, and it's a big if there's one binding thread that allows us to understand something about the strategy of the Trump administration, that binding thread has to be energy.
Right.
You know, what connects Venezuela and Iran? You know, when I woke up a day early in January and saw that the United States had, and you know, it takes you a little while to absorb the reality of what's happened. The United States had kidnapped the president of a sovereign state in South America. Once I got over the shock, I immediately came to the conclusion that there would be a war in the Middle East before summer. Because securing a particular flow of energy, Venezuelan oil, was a necessary precondition for the adventure in Iran. And Russia is marginal to some extent to that great game, the kind of the global energy wars, but it's not completely irrelevant. So I think you're right. You can draw the conclusion that the United States may not be quite as interested in the forward strategy that provoked the conflict, but it doesn't have any particular compelling interest in ending the conflict, because an embattled and distracted Russia with its oil production, at least unsettled and mitigated, fits the broad strategy of the Trump administration. I realize I'm making the schoolboy error of trying to draw reasonable and rational conclusions about American foreign policy in the era of Donald Trump. So I apologize for that.
No. I mean, even if it wasn't intentional, if that's what the outcome is, then it is fair to point out that this is one of the things that one group of the United States does like, right? The people who benefit from all of these energy ties that are being created, and all of the money that is to be made with that. And we know the United States runs on money, and we see that. I mean, the president just earned $1 billion in the last year just by by his wealth being strategically allocated by other people and benefiting from geopolitical upheaval he makes. So there are other people who do that too, and they will come out of this and say like, well, it was a great time, it's an awesome time, we made a lot of money out of it. And on the other hand, in Russia, you won't have that. In Europe, you might have a couple of elites who benefit from these transatlantic networks and so on, and therefore are on board with it. But the large part of the population, of course, loses out. In Ukraine, they are literally asked to bleed for that and die in the hundreds of thousands for it. And that's this shocking aspect of the immorality of calling for the support of Ukraine, right? And being a friend of Ukraine while you now the Europeans start even pushing people back, right? Military aged boys and men who now have to go back and further bleed for this kind of racket.
Yeah, when we displace from US policy back to the European theater, this is when it becomes, from my perspective, completely inexplicable. This is where we have to evoke, I think, psychologistic categories once again. You simply cannot make strategic sense of why the continent of Europe appears to be prepared to rearm in order to prolong the Ukraine conflict. I saw,
or even extend it outside of Europe.
Well, this is the kind of this is the standoff. This is where we are. And again, from a Russian point of view, just before I come back to the Western countries, my calculation is that Russia has strategized this conflict in terms of, I think their conclusion is they can control a conflict in Ukraine. And again, going back to the key point about Western misunderstanding of Russia and the Russian mindset, I think the Russians are prepared, if necessary, to control that limited conflict for as long as it takes. I think John Mearsheimer described the most likely outcome as a messy Russian win. And I presume what he means by messy is that it will run on for a number of further years, and there will be even greater casualties. So Russia is prepared, I think, to dig in and can live with a limited conflict that it can control. What it can't control You can't strategically, you can't game an escalated wider conflict involving other Western. Russia clearly doesn't want that. Now, again, the European countries seem to understand that is not what Russia wants. And that appears to be the only rational reason why they have concluded, therefore, that must be what they have to do. What Russia doesn't want is what we must pursue. Now, the fact that I don't think any Western European country has the military capacity to pursue an extended conflict with Russia. That appears to be close to irrelevant. And I was just about to say, I watched with a mixture of amusement and horror the celebrations of Bastille Day in France yesterday, where the foreign minister was making great play of the military participation of, I think, up to 27 countries. It reminded me of a May Day parade in Red Square in Soviet times, but at the Arc de Triomphe. This kind of, this theatrical military posturing. There is something awry in the strategic calculation of the Western European members of NATO. And I don't profess to understand. From a British perspective, you may be aware of this. We're reminded every couple of months in the press, and you can tell the mainstream media move like a kind of flock of birds or a shoal of fish. The same message appears in numerous outlets at the same time. We are being prepared for potential conscription, the necessity of a conflict with Russia. And the irony is this is presented as defensive.
Yeah.
This is something that we are going to have to face because Russia is an expansionist, authoritarian, aggressive power. And again, this is the heart of the matter. This is what I want to come back to. That may be a misunderstanding. It may be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the orientation of Russian foreign policy, or it may be the latest cynical lie produced by security services who have a vested interest in maintaining the illusion of a live and present danger. The problem in all this, and this is why I evoke the psychologistic, how that misunderstanding or deception, whichever we conclude it is, on the part of political elites, is transmitted to the broader public. How the broader public can be made to believe or invest in the idea of the necessity of a conflict with Russia. Now, public opinion is a notoriously kind of slippery thing. We can, everybody's got a view on what public opinion is at any one time, but we don't quite know what public opinion is going to be until it's tested.
Yep.
And I would hope, at least in the British context, that if and when it is tested in relation to some kind of conflict with Russia, British public opinion will fall on the rational side of the argument. But that's a speculation on my part.
Yeah, I mean, hope dies last, right? But it's a pretty precarious moment when we also see just how then also, and maybe this is where it ties in with Russophobia, how this, even if we assume that it's a misunderstanding of Russia, how that then is politicized and then translated through propaganda and Russophobia into something politically useful, because what you need is, you're just in the bell curve, you need just the middle part that basically goes along and everything's fine, right? You will have enough conscripts and whatnot in order to do whatever kind of policy you're envisioning, as long as you have the middle part, right, of the 55% is enough, more than enough, in order to drive it further. You can even do with less. Again, Mr. Zelensky was elected in 2017 on a peace platform of peace with Russia, right? And he overwhelmingly won that one. And still, that was not enough in order to kind of change the course of the ship that already had a certain direction. It's landed us where it is. The question, maybe the last thing I will ask you, is the your assessment of where Russia then is today with its understanding of how the West works. Because again, you alluded to people like Mr. Karaganov who are saying like, look, we need to nuke Europe in order to re-establish deterrence. We still have Mr. Vladimir Putin, who seems to have a completely different strategy when it also comes to the drone war, and says like, look, we're winning on the battlefield. We're not going to squander that. We're not going to give the Europeans an Europeanization of the war. In return, there's no other way to absorbing certain shocks and dealing with them. Where do you think is the understanding of the, let's say, Russia's like central part of how to deal with the fact that the Europeans are utterly unwilling to give them a security arrangement?
Well, here I think there is paradoxically cause for hope. Because if we accept the premise that I've offered, that Russian foreign policy historically through different kind of, governments of different political orientations has been fundamentally defensive. If that is true, then that's the basis for hope that that will continue to be true. And that's my estimation. I think, as I said a moment ago, the Russians have reached the conclusion that they can control a limited conflict in Ukraine, but they are unlikely to be able to control the variables of an extended conflict with the broader NATO family. Therefore, we might conclude that whatever noises are made, and these noises have a kind of they have a structural function, don't they? The late night chat show, or the former president who's extremely active on Twitter is able to say things that respectable representatives of the current government are not. I think most of that is noise.
Right.
And sometimes it's noise produced in anger, which is understandable. My estimation is that noise is not liable to inform strategic policy, and that Russia is likely to maintain its fundamentally defensive foreign policy, even in the face of increased provocation. Now, again, as we discussed briefly in terms of the preparation for the Ukraine conflict, that puts them in a difficult situation where they may have to find ways to deal with and make limited response to further provocations without escalating. But if I had to put my money on the escalation or non-escalation, I think I would put my money on non-escalation. And we would have this core Russian foreign policy of forward defense to thank for that, rather than any enlightened strategy on the part of the West and the NATO countries.
I really like that analysis, and let's end on this positive note, because we can put our hope into the basket of like Russian rationality and not the Western, like getting the West getting back to sanity, which it seems farther away than ever. But let's end it there. Alistair, people who want to follow you, I know you also write under a pen name. I mean, where should they go to read from you? Read about you.
They'll find me on Substack as Alessandro Del Guado, which is my literary pseudonym. And they'll find my novel, Pechorin. That's a name any of your Russian listeners will recognize. Wherever they buy their books, or on the website of the publisher Faction Books. Alessandro Del Guado. Don't ask me why the author of a faux Russian novel of the 19th century has an Italian pseudonym. It's a long story.
We will cover that one in another interview another day. For now, Alistair Renfrew, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Thank you.